So my name is Judith and I'm a storyteller. Because it's a very unconventional profession, I often get the question, how did you decide to become a storyteller? Because it doesn't really feel like the kind of answer that a 15-year-old gives in like a high school test. Do you want to be a banker? Do you want to be a storyteller? You know, it's not in the list somewhere. And so when I'm asked the question, it's a difficult one because I actually never made the decision to become a storyteller. It's not really something that I planned. It's more something that happened in a game of improvisation. And you know, the famous question, where do you want to be in 5 years? You know, they always ask this in terms of vision. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? Well, I've literally never had an answer to that one question. My guiding question has been, where do you see yourself in 5 minutes? And it feels like a lack of plan, and somehow it's something that's frowned upon. You're supposed to have a plan, you're supposed to have a vision. But what I've found is that not having a plan is actually what has allowed me to do what I'm doing. Because I didn't have a plan, I was able to see the doors that opened in front of me. When we have a plan and we're holding on to it so fast, sometimes doors and wonderful serendipitous opportunities happen, and we're like, no, but I have a plan, I have to go there. And we miss out on it. But if you don't have a plan, they're like, oh, that's interesting, I'll go there. So that's sort of the way that I evolved into this strange profession. So, of course, I always had some form of creative expression in my life. I grew up in an art commune, and my entire life I did something. I'm a very unsuccessful musician, but from the age of 5 till today, I've always studied some kind of instrument. So I've studied the violin, then I studied the guitar, then I studied the clarinet, then I did some balama for a while, and I moved on to the accordion, which I'm still very unsuccessfully trying to learn. I've done printmaking, photography, I did a lot of darkroom, I got some awards in photography, got into a museum, did painting, drawing, I started 2 different theater groups, I did improv, I was on a team, I did dance, I am in bookbinding, all sorts of creative activities. But I never really thought, oh, this is something that I have to take to the professional level, this is my goal, this is my aim. And then one day, I ran into storytelling, and I studied storytelling when I was in my 20s in Paris. And when I found storytelling, I remember thinking, wow, that's it. That is the one discipline that involves everything. It felt like I had come at a crossroad of all the disciplines and all the paths that I had taken so far. And it's a wonderful thing to come across. In storytelling, I had studied literature, I could use literature, I could use the stage art, all the dancing I'd done, all the theater. I could use my unsuccessful learning of music to create little songs that I included in my stories. I could do bookbinding and illustrate my own stories. Like everything I had done so far, it somehow collided into this one place. And I was like, oh, that makes sense. It's wonderful. And it's a great thing when you find that one thing in your life where everything you love so far comes under that one roof. It's something that I wish to all of you. And so once I found this, what did I do? Well, I stopped telling stories completely, and for many years. It wasn't very intentional. What I did is I was in my 20s, and so I wanted to travel. And so I applied. My plan was to go to a country where I didn't know the language, and I didn't know the culture, and be lost and lose all of my marks. Because I find that when you lose all your marks, that's the best way to stretch yourself. And I was 20, and I really wanted to expand my limits a little. So I got a job. There was a job in Cameroon, one in Egypt, one in Turkey. I got the job in Turkey and I came here. And then it was everything I wanted it to be. It was difficult, it was confusing, it was challenging. I had fun, I loved it. After 1 year, they offered me a position at ODTÜ, at METU, at the Middle East Technical University. And METU is a great university. And I thought, well, I'm in my 20s, I'm a recent graduate, I just got my master's. Teaching freshman writing and presentation at a university, that sounds like something fun. Why don't I do that? So I did that. I stayed at METU, and I started, because I need to always have some kind of creative expression in my life, I found a little ceramic studio, and I started doing ceramic sculpture. That's some of my work. And so I changed. And so you're going to say, well, what about the storytelling? Wasn't that like the great crossroad, the convergence of everything you loved? Why didn't you do that? Well, I didn't speak Turkish. That's a good reason not to tell stories in a place where everybody speaks Turkish. And storytelling was completely dead in Turkey. It was considered to be a village art, a folk art that had died with technology, and no one was doing it. And it's a little difficult when you don't speak the language and you're not really from the culture to start something that doesn't exist in the country and you're not even sure people are into it. So I taught at Metu and I did ceramics. And then what happened? After about 5 years in Turkey, my Turkish started getting better. And storytelling, it came back in my life, like that seed that I had planted in the ground. And completely by itself, it started sprouting with such small steps, such easy, natural steps that I didn't even realize it was really coming back. I mean, if someone had told me, you're going to be telling stories in Turkish in front of hundreds of people, I would have been like, and I would have ran the other way. You know? If people had said, you're not only going to start storytelling, you're going to start a movement where you're going to teach hundreds of storytellers, and there'll be storytellers everywhere in Turkey, and it will be this huge national movement, I would have been like, sure, of course, I'm going to pack my bags now and go very silently. But that's not how it happened. It started with one step. I was taking a yoga teacher training, and we were talking about Indian mythology. And I was like, oh, I know Indian mythology. I could tell some stories. So to my classmates at the yoga teacher training, I told a few stories. And they were like, that's nice. You should tell us more stories. And the owner of the studio, Yoga Shala, they said, why don't you do story yoga? And it would be 5-minute story. And then you would include the theme of the story into the theme of the class. And I thought, a 5-minute story in Turkish. I can do that. That's small enough, right? 5 minutes. I mean, in Turkish, it's difficult, but 5 minutes, okay. So I started doing story yoga. And then people came into my classes and they said, I like that story that you told us the other day, but I tried to tell it to my friend and I couldn't remember the end and I forgot the beginning. The middle was a little unclear. When you told it, it was funny, but when I told it, no one laughed. You know, what's the trick to this? Is there like a trick? Can you teach us something? And I was like, well, that's an art and I've studied it. I could do a workshop. And they're like, oh, do that. So I started teaching workshops. And that's a small step, right? And then I have a friend, my friend Yeşim, who has a writing house in Kadıköy, and she said, well, Judith, why don't you do a little story gathering in Turkish? And I said, no, I can't do a show in Turkish. And she said, you know what we'll do? I have my little writing house, and we'll put it on Facebook, and maybe people will come, and maybe they won't come. That felt good. And if they don't come, you'll tell me stories, and I'll tell you stories. And I like Yeşim, and I like telling stories, so I was like, okay, I'm just going to tell stories to Yeşim, and if people come, we'll figure it out. And Yeşim said, don't worry, I'll make hot wine. That made things much better. So we prepared hot wine, and we put it on Facebook, and 20 people came. And it was a lot of fun. And then we did an open stage, people told stories, and the next month, we had 30 people. And the next month, we had 40 people. And people told their friends. And next month, we had 50 people, and now the living room is really small. And so people were standing, and there was no room, and I was like telling stories, trying not to make very big gestures, so as we had eliminated the wine glasses. You know, and my friend Yeşim said, you got to go bigger. I was like, oh, I don't know if I want to go bigger. This is really scary. And she said, you got to find a bigger performance center. Call places. And I was like, I don't want to call anyone. And then just that minute, the miracle is people talk. And so people who come, they talk about what you do, and they say there's this great gathering happening in a really small space. And so a big culture, a bigger space called me, and they said, we hear you. You have a nice gathering. Would you like to do it at our place? And I was like, okay, well, we need space. So we moved. The next month, we had 80 people. And then we had 100. And then just 1 month after we had started, we had 160 people completely squeezed in a little theater in Nazım Hikmet Culture Merkezi. This is the poster we had. And it'd been just 12 months, and it was really crowded. It was this big thing. And then all of a sudden I looked, and it wasn't such a small step anymore. it had a series of small steps that had led to something much bigger. And of course, workshops, and people started doing similar nights everywhere in Turkey. And I had a lot of students who started it, and I also went to a lot of different cities to do this. And then people started telling me, why don't you write a book of the stories you tell? And I was like, no, I don't write a book. My job is to tell the stories, not to squeeze them in between the pages of a book. So I was against this. But then I thought, wouldn't it be nice to have a book that's like a game? You can open it in a random place and ask it a question. And then you open it and you go, oh, that's the story that answers my question. That's a nice idea. I'd like to do that. But of course, I have no idea how to find a publisher. And the thing is, when you do what you love, people talk about it. And you talk about it. So I had done a TED Talk. And Doan, which is a big publishing house, they called me and they said, hey, we watched your TED Talk. Do you have a book you'd like to write? And I was like, yeah, did someone tell you? I have just thought about this. So I told them about my project. They're like, perfect, we want to publish this. When is it ready? We'll publish it. So I published a book. And then it did 17 reprints in 6 months. And it's still in the bestseller list. So that was really good. And that opened a lot of other doors. So people who read my book, this filmmaker called me and he said, would you like to help us on this scenario we're working on? And after a book, it's a small step. So I helped them on this scenario. And then they wrote a part for me, and they said, do you want to play in our film? So I played in this film with Mert Firat. And so that was fun. And then a friend of mine said, what would you like to do now? I'm like, I don't know. You know what would be fun? It would be fun to have a radio show. And she said, well, why don't you take steps and plan it and have a strategy? I was like, I don't do that. And then the phone rang, people talk. And I was invited to be a guest on a radio show. And I was talking to the producer at the radio show, and she said, what do you do? I said, well, I tell stories, and I wrote a book, and I'm about to come out in a film with Mert Firat. And she said, have you ever thought about having your own radio show? I was like, me? I don't know. And she's like, you should try it. So half an hour later, I was doing a demo in this thing, and I'm like, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, let's see. So 2 months later, I started my radio show, and it's been a #1 show on NTV Radio for about a year now. Overall, if you ask me now, what steps I took small steps. And if you ask me what I'm going to do in 5 years, I still have no idea. I still don't have a master plan. But I know that it doesn't really matter. What I need to do is just to go slow, listen, and take one more step on the way and see what's going to come up. Thank you.